My mom was at this time on meth and heroin. Shai was on coke. I think it's environmental, I think it's genetic, and I think it's just a decision.
For years, fans have heard Jelly Roll tell his redemption story. The jail cells, the illegal substances, the music that saved him. He has told it on podcasts, at the Grammys, in front of the United States Senate. But there is one version of that story that nobody had heard until last year. Then his daughter sat down on a podcast and told it herself. What 16-year-old Bailee Ann revealed wasn't what anyone expected, and it changes everything you thought you knew about that family. The phone call that changed everything. On May 22, 2008, a prison guard walked up to a cell inside the Davidson County Jail in Nashville and knocked on the door. Inside was a 23-year-old inmate named Jason Bradley DeFord, serving time on a felony possession with intent to distribute charge. He had been in and out of correctional facilities since he was a teenager. By his own count given on radio interviews years later, he had been arrested more than 40 times by the age of 25. The guard told him his daughter had just been born. Jelly Roll has told this story across nearly every major outlet he has appeared on since his rise to country music fame. In his Billboard cover story from June of 2023, he described it as the first moment in his life that he felt an urgent pull to become someone different. On Jimmy Kimmel Live in June of 2024, he compared it to the Damascus Road moment from the Bible, the moment Saul turned to Paul. He said it was the first time he had cried in years. On Sunday Today with Willie Geist that October, he described looking around the jail cell with $17 worth of honey buns and potato chips to his name and realizing he was now responsible for a child. The daughter was Bailee Ann DeFord, born to a woman named Felicia A. Beckwith. Jelly Roll had been in a relationship with Felicia in the years before his most recent incarceration. By the time Bailee was born, the relationship was already strained, and the legal situation that would follow over the next decade would prove more complicated than the inspirational version of the story usually suggests. When Jelly Roll was released around the time of Bailee's second birthday in 2010, he met her in person for the first time. He has said in multiple interviews that the visits were limited at first because Felicia controlled access. On the Smartless podcast in March of 2025, Jelly Roll described going to court every 6 months for years, fighting to gain expanded visitation, then partial custody, then full custody. He told the hosts he just kept showing up and proving he was changing. Music, he said, wasn't even part of the picture yet. He just wanted to be a good dad. But the custody fight took longer than anyone outside that family understood, and the conditions Bailee was living in during those were far worse than the public ever knew at the time. The girl he came home to. Felicia Beckwith was, by all accounts, present in Bailee's early life. Bailee lived with Felicia and her maternal grandparents for the first several years. Then, in 2015, Felicia was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. The diagnosis came with prescription pain medication. That medication, according to Jelly Roll's own statements in the Hulu documentary Save Me, which premiered at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville on May 30, 2023, became the beginning of an addiction spiral that would consume the next decade of their lives. Jelly Roll said in the documentary that he could see what was happening before anyone wanted to admit it. He described watching her pill dependency escalate, then watching it transition into something far worse. By the time Felicia was in full addiction, the household Bailee was growing up in had collapsed. But the most detailed account of those years did not come from Jelly Roll. It came from Bailee herself, sitting across from her stepmother Bunny XO on the Dumb Blonde podcast in February of 2024. The episode is titled Bailee Ann Strength and Healing. It was released on February 21st. The full transcript is publicly available online. In her own words, Bailee said the decline began when she was in kindergarten. By first grade, she said, things were essentially gone. She described the condition of the house she lived in during those years as horrendous said it still gave her nightmares as a teenager, and made clear that her memories of that period were not vague impressions, but specific scenes she carried with her. Bailee was a young child being raised inside an active addiction. Her father, meanwhile, was building a music career out of the back of a van and slowly, court date by court date, working his way toward being able to take her home. The custody picture finally changed in 2016. That year, Jelly Roll met a Las Vegas podcaster named Alyssa, known publicly as Bunny XO, at a small venue called the Las Vegas Country Saloon. Their relationship moved quickly. They eloped at a Las Vegas courthouse in late August of 2016. Almost immediately, the two of them began pushing for full custody of Bailee. The legal process was completed in 2017. On the Smartless podcast, in March of 2025, Jelly Roll confirmed the year directly. He said he and his wife had had full custody of his daughter for 8 years, which lines up exactly with a 2017 handover. He also said, plainly, that he could not have gotten that custody without Bunny XO. In his Billboard interview, he had said the same thing in slightly different words, calling her the woman who came in and took on a child that was about to be hers in everything but biology, and admitting that he would never have had the stability or the money to win that case alone. On the Boossin' with the Boys podcast in June of 2024, Jelly Roll went further. He said outright that Bunny XO had personally paid for the legal fees during the custody fight in the early years before he had any meaningful music income. The woman, who would later become a podcast host and a public figure in her own right, had bankrolled the case that brought Bailee home. Bunny XO has also talked openly about her own role in the family. She has consistently described herself as a bonus mom rather than an adoptive one, even though she is the only mother figure Bailee has lived with full-time since she was 8. Bunny has said in multiple posts and interviews that Bailee calls her mom by choice, not by request. There is one other detail from the People magazine cover story in November of 2024 that puts the whole custody arrangement in perspective. Jelly Roll told the reporter that Bailee had been in the same public school district for 10 years. The same friends, the same teachers, the same routines. While he was building one of the most chaotic careers in the music industry, he and Bunny XO had deliberately kept Bailee's life as ordinary as possible. She didn't switch to private school when the money came in. She didn't change districts when he got famous. The stability was treated as the priority. So what was Bailee living through while all of this was being negotiated? And what did she eventually do with the music she found inside that chaos? Tears could talk. In 2020, when Bailee was 10 years old, she sat down with her father and told him she wanted to write a song. She has since said in podcast interviews that she viewed songwriting as a form of therapy. The song they wrote together was called Tears Could Talk. It was released that year on Jelly Roll's album A Beautiful Disaster, credited as a featured collaboration with his daughter. The song was about Felicia. Jelly Roll has been careful in public interviews to let Bailee speak for herself about that song when she chooses to. But he has discussed the writing process on multiple occasions. He has said in his Sunday Today interview and elsewhere that he was struck by how clearly she understood what she was processing at age 10 and how much of it she was able to put into her own lyrics rather than borrow his. 3 years later, on July 11th of 2023, Jelly Roll was performing the Backroad Baptism Tour in Alpharetta, Georgia. Mid-show, he told the audience that his 15-year-old daughter was with him on the road that night. He explained, in his own way, that she had written a song years earlier about therapy through music, and that he wanted the crowd to meet her. Bailee walked out on stage and performed Tears Could Talk in front of a stadium audience. It was the most public moment in their relationship at that point. It was also, by every account from people in the audience and from later interviews, entirely her decision. She wasn't being pushed into the spotlight. She was choosing it. That summer would turn out to be the calm before the storm. Because by the time Bailee was performing on stage with her father in Georgia, The events of the previous summer were still working their way through her in ways the public would not learn about until she finally talked about them herself. And what she had been hiding was much worse than anyone outside the family understood. The summer everything broke. In the summer of 2022, Bailee was 14 years old. Felicia, who had been periodically attempting recovery, was in what Bailee later described as a sober period, and Bailee chose to spend a portion of the summer with her. The relapse happened during that summer. On the February 2024 Dumb Blonde podcast, Bailee laid out the specifics herself. She described her mother introducing her to marijuana, then alcohol, then illegal substances. She described other substances coming into the picture in ways no 14-year-old should ever encounter from a parent. The mother, who was supposed to be in recovery, had brought her own daughter into the relapse. The breaking point, Bailee said in her own words on that podcast, was the 4th of July of that year. She got into the car with Felicia. Her mother told her, in the casual way that turned the whole moment into a horror story for Bailee, that they were stopping by her dealer first. Bailee, sitting in the passenger seat at 14 years old, realized in that moment that everything she had been hoping about her mother's recovery was over. She came home to her father and Bunny XO at the end of the summer in crisis. What Bailee did not tell anyone outside the family at that time, but did eventually disclose on the podcast, was that she was carrying years of compounding mental health struggles underneath the surface. She had been quietly struggling for far longer than anyone realized. Her parents stepped in. What they did next was not a casual decision. Jelly Roll and Bunny XO made the call to enroll Bailee in a residential wilderness therapy program designed for adolescents in crisis. The program lasted approximately 8 weeks. Bailee herself stayed nearly 9 weeks, voluntarily extending her own time after her parents came to visit her. She has talked about that extension as her own decision. She wasn't being kept there. She chose more time. When she came home, she did something that took most people in her position decades to do. She made the call to cut Felicia out of her life entirely. But would the daughter who had survived all of that be willing to tell the world what she had lived through? And what made her decide to finally do it on her stepmother's podcast in early 2024? Strength and healing. The February 21st, 2024 episode of Dumb Blonde is, to date, the single most detailed public statement Bailee Ann has ever made about her own life. The episode title is Bailee Ann Strength and Healing. Bunny XO is the host. The two of them sat down together and went through it. Bailee spoke for the entire episode without flinching. She walked through the timeline of Felicia's addiction. She talked about the house she grew up in. She talked about her grandmother trying to keep things together. She talked about Felicia's periods of incarceration and the reconnection in 6th grade when her mother was in sober living. She talked about the summer of 2022 and the 4th of July moment. She talked about the wilderness program. She talked about her own depression, her own anger, her own self-medication during that period. And then she said something that landed harder than anything else in the episode. She said that her mother, in her view, was without a soul. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the kind of clarity that comes from a teenager who has thought about it for years and arrived at a conclusion she is no longer willing to soften. For a 15-year-old to articulate what Bailee articulated on that podcast in that level of detail, on her own terms, with her stepmother across from her, is something that even seasoned interviewers have called remarkable. It was not packaged. It was not rehearsed. It was a young person who had survived something she did not deserve and who had decided, for her own reasons, that she was ready to talk about it. The episode was eventually streamed millions of times. Clips of it spread across TikTok and Instagram. People who had only known the polished version of Jelly Roll's family story were suddenly hearing the actual one from the actual person who had lived through it. And the most important thing about that episode is that nothing in it was about Jelly Roll being a bad father. Every word of it was about Felicia. Every word of it was about what she did, what she failed to do, and what it cost Bailee. Bailee did not expose her father on that podcast. She exposed her mother. And in doing so, almost without seeming to try, she made it impossible to see her father as anything other than the parent who actually showed up. The next time Bailee appeared on Dumb Blonde, 9 months later, she revealed something even more surprising about herself. The daughter who wants to be president. In November of 2024, Bailee returned to her stepmother's podcast. She was 16 by then. The earlier conversation had been about survival. This one was about plans. She told Bunny XO in language that did not have the cadence of a teenager fantasizing about a fancy future, but the cadence of a teenager who had already done the research, that she wanted to go to Columbia University. She wanted to study law. She specified criminal defense. She said sex offenders were one category she didn't think she could represent, but otherwise, she wanted to work inside the criminal justice system as a defense attorney. Then she said something that has stuck with everyone who heard it. She said she wanted to turn the judicial system upside down, and the best way to do it was from the inside. She floated becoming a judge, becoming a congresswoman, possibly running for president. She also addressed her father directly in that episode. She said that for years she had hated Western medicine and the way the country handled health insurance, and she had considered going into medicine before she landed on law. She talked about her grades. By her father's own account on the Smartless podcast in March of 2025, Bailee maintains one of the highest grade point averages at her high school. She is dual-enrolled in college courses as a junior, meaning she is already taking university classes while still in high school. And she addressed her own visibility. She said that she and her friends had basically gotten used to her father being famous. He came to her football games. The novelty had worn off. Everyone at her school had stopped acting like it was a big deal. This is the part of the story that almost nobody covers, and it is the part that makes the entire narrative arc click into place. The daughter of one of the most chaotic biographies in modern country music, the girl who lived through her mother's addiction, who was driven to her mother's dealer at 14, who spent 9 weeks in residential treatment, who could have ended up in any number of statistical categories, is sitting in 11th grade with the highest grades in her school, taking college courses, planning to apply to an Ivy League law program, and discussing whether she wants to be a judge or a member of Congress. She also made it clear on that podcast that she has no interest in following her father into music. She said she has no plans to pursue it. She had written songs as a child because writing was her outlet. But as a teenager, she had moved past it. Her path was law. Her instrument was going to be the courtroom, not the studio. For a daughter of a Grammy-nominated country artist to say that on her stepmother's podcast without hesitation is itself a kind of declaration. She was not going to be defined by the industry her father had broken into. She was going to build her own. She is not the wounded child of the redemption story. She is the protagonist of her own. So what has her father actually said about her in the same period she was making all of this public? What he has said about her. Jelly Roll's most direct on-the-record statements about Bailee as a person, rather than as a redemption symbol, came in a People magazine cover story published on November 27, 2024. The interview was conducted around the release of his beautifully broken album and tour. He told the People reporter that Bailee was emotionally intelligent in a way he had never been at her age. He said she could read a room better than most adults he knew. He recounted a recent conversation in which she had been trying to talk her way out of being grounded for something, and he had told her, in essence, that she was so much smarter than he had been at 16 that she shouldn't try to weaponize his past to get out of consequences. He pointed out, with self-deprecation, that she was using emotional manipulation skills he had never developed. He also said something in that interview that runs counter to a lot of celebrity kid mythology. He said Bailee was, in his words, a really grounded kid. She had attended the same public school district for 10 years. She had the same friends she had made when he and Bunny XO first took custody of her. The stability of that environment, he said, was probably the single biggest factor in how she had turned out. In his testimony before the United States Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs on January 11, 2024, Jelly Roll referenced Bailee directly. He was testifying about fentanyl. He told the senators that he had a 15-year-old daughter whose mother was an addict, and that every single day he looked in the eyes of someone inside his own home who was a victim of the crisis. He said he had to wonder, every day, whether today was going to be the day he had to tell his daughter that her mother had become part of the national statistic. That moment is the clearest example of how Jelly Roll has chosen to talk about Bailee in public. He doesn't lean on her for sympathy. He doesn't use her for content. He refers to her with the kind of protectiveness that takes years of being the steady parent to earn the right to demonstrate. In March of 2024, after Felicia was arrested again on illegal substance charges, Jelly Roll appeared on the Pivot podcast and described what it was like watching Bailee see her mother's mugshot online. He said his daughter was 16 and didn't have the emotional tools to process seeing her own mother's face in that condition on a public website. He said the addict was not the victim in those situations, the family was. The next year, in the spring of 2025, would bring a different kind of milestone for both of them. The album that bears their names. On October 11, 2024, Jelly Roll released Beautifully Broken. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 with 161,000 album equivalent units in its first week, the third largest country debut of the year behind Beyoncé and Post Malone. The label that issued the album was called Bailee and Buddy Management. Buddy is Noah's middle name. The imprint, distributed through Stony Creek and Republic, is named after both of Jelly Roll's children. Every record his music label puts out, in other words, carries their names on the package. The Beautifully Broken tour that followed grossed $79 million across 56 shows and sold approximately 685,000 tickets. On April 26, 2024, at the Stagecoach Festival in Indio, California, Jelly Roll brought Bailee out on stage in front of the crowd. He told the audience he had taken his daughter out of school that day and flown her to California for the show. He said he was trying to earn cool dad points. He pointed out that she was about to turn 16 in roughly 10 days. In April of 2025, Bailee attended her first prom. She wore a yellow gown. Jelly Roll documented the night on social media and was visibly emotional. Bunny XO posted that the family had managed to give Bailee a prom night, something neither of her parents had experienced themselves at her age because of how their own teenage years had gone. The Stagecoach moment, the prom, the tour, the album bearing her name on the imprint were all part of a sustained pattern that had been building for years. The first time Bailee had walked a red carpet alongside her father had been at the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards in Santa Monica on July 13, 2024. She had appeared with Jelly Roll, Bunny XO, and her younger brother Noah in matching denim outfits. Noah's appearance that night was his first official red carpet event. Bailee was the visible older sister and the calm one. The photos from the night went viral. Jelly Roll later told an interviewer that he had called it Daddy Date Night and that he had taken both of his kids to a kids' event because they were the reason he had a career to celebrate. At the CMA Awards on November 20, 2024, Bailee attended again. Her father was nominated for Entertainer of the Year, Male Vocalist of the Year, and Album of the Year. He won none of them. After the show, Jelly Roll posted a message to his family on social media. He wrote that he wanted to thank his wife and daughter for standing by him when he was not worth standing by, and that he was glad they were enjoying the ride together. The post did not get the attention his wins would have, but the people who read it understood what it was. It was the same theme he had been articulating in every interview since the beginning of his rise. The family came first because the family had built him. Then, in December of 2025, Bailee did something neither of her parents saw coming. She organized a surprise event for them. Bunny XO documented the moment publicly. Bailee, knowing that neither Jelly Roll nor Bunny XO had attended their own high school proms growing up, threw them a themed event called Prom Under the Stars. She invited friends and family. She decorated. She crowned them king and queen. She did for them what nobody had done for them at the age they should have done it themselves. Bunny XO wrote afterward that the night had stopped them in their tracks. The teenager who had survived everything she had survived had used her own time and her own resources to give her parents something most kids would never think to give. So what does the whole story actually expose when all of it is laid out together? The verdict. The John Gosselin video that probably prompted this whole exercise framed an adult daughter exposing a parent who had failed her. Bailee Ann's testimony on her stepmother's podcast did not follow that template. What she exposed on the record, in her own voice, was the truth about her bio mother. What she also exposed, almost as a consequence, was the truth about her father. She didn't praise him on the podcast. She didn't have to. She talked about the chaos of her early years, the conditions she grew up in, the addiction that defined her childhood, and in doing so, she made it impossible to miss who had actually been there for her. He had been the one who had spent years going to court every 6 months trying to win the right to take her home. He had been the one who had stayed sober and built a life that could hold her. He had been the one who had made the call to send her to wilderness therapy when she came home in crisis. He had been the one who had named his record label after both of his children, who had testified before the Senate about her, who had told Rolling Stone and People and Sunday Today and Smartless that she had saved his life rather than the other way around. The truth Bailee Ann exposed about her father, by speaking honestly about her childhood, is that he was the one who showed up. Not because he was perfect, not because he doesn't carry the consequences of his own past, but because, in the binary that her life forced into existence between a mother who chose addiction and a father who chose recovery, he was the one she could count on. The 17-year-old who told that story on a podcast last year is now headed toward Columbia, toward law school, toward a career she has mapped out with the clarity of someone who has already survived more than most people survive in a lifetime. She has done what every daughter of every famous parent gets asked to do at some point. She has told her own version. What she said was the truth. And the truth was the opposite of what the clickbait usually promises. That is what Jelly Roll's daughter actually said. About her mother, about her father, about herself. If you liked this, hit like and subscribe. And make sure to check out our other videos.